So I tried to call my husband to let him know. Well, I dialed the phone number. He picked up the phone, and I told him that I was sick. I was going to the hospital, and there was a long pause. And he said, "I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong number."
Welcome to the Strokecast. A Generation X stroke survivor explores rehab, recovery, the frontiers of neuroscience, and how to peel a banana with one hand.
Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 142 of the Strokecast. Today's episode is brought to you by the fine folks at Modus Nova. To find out if Modus Nova can help you recover the use of an affected limb after stroke, visit strokecast.com/Modus Nova. And by the fine folks at Like Minded. To learn if this nonprofit membership community can help you live your best post-stroke life, visit strokecast.com/Like Minded. Semi-retired Joanne Glim was working her first day on a temp job at the Tropicana offices in Florida when disaster struck. You see, somebody forgot to order the sandwiches for a meeting. Ever the problem solver, Joanne put her problem-solving skills to work, acquired a corporate credit card, and zipped off to a nearby deli to try and cajole the proprietor into making 17 box lunches on zero notice while he had a store full of people in the middle of the lunch rush. Of course, in the middle of all that, Joanne suffered a stroke. She lost speech, she lost half her body, and she would go on to lose a lot more. She also gained a lot more in the process, though. Today, Joanne joins us to talk about her memoir, Trapped Within, a true story of survival, recovery, love, and hope. From start to finish, it took her more than 17 years to write, but when the time was right, she had it done. We talk about all that and more. But the important question is, did she get the sandwiches? Let's meet Joanne Glim and find out. Joanne, thanks so much for joining us on the show this week.
Thank you for inviting me.
I mean, I think this is going to be really interesting because I did just finish your book, Trapped Within. Really great book, and a couple things I really liked about it, especially for the stroke survivor community, is that it's easy to read, and you've got some really nice short chapters in here. So it's very easy for somebody who may struggle with attention or struggle with their own reading. You can read 4 or 5 pages, and you've got a natural place where you can break. So, I mean, I think that's great especially for a lot of folks who've survived stroke.
Thank you.
I mean, as a survivor yourself, I mean, what was your life like before your stroke?
I was very active. I was physically fit. I didn't smoke, didn't drink. My weight was fine. I loved to do things that were physical. I ate well, and I probably was just as surprised as everybody else when I had a stroke. Even though my mother had passed away from a stroke when she was 52. But she was just the opposite. She smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day. Plus, she was overweight. I was 14 when she passed away. It took me until I was 28 to realize that being a smart-mouthed teenager was not what killed her. You know, it was a combination of all these other things.
And sometimes, of course, doesn't make any difference at all. And like I say, in your case, it just came out of the blue. There was no known reason for that. Plus, back in the 50s, I mean, care when somebody just suddenly had a stroke was so different than today. There was no TPA. There was no mechanical thrombectomy or doing any brain surgery. So if you had a stroke then, there was nothing they could do, really.
That's right. My stroke was in 1996, And even though they had a number of these different ways that they could treat you, I had a hemorrhagic stroke in the thalamus area, which is deep within the brain. And because of where it was located, I had to tough it out. There was no way they could do surgery or anything else for me.
And they've come a long way with therapy since then. But once you've got the damages, there's only so much they can do before it comes. It relies a lot more on what we as survivors are willing to do. So yeah.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, a lot of times when people have a stroke, it's such a shock to the system, because we have relied our whole lives on our body to get us out of everything, and we know that between our mind and our body, we have a good working machine, and we can trust it to take care of us. And so I think the first response, at least that I had, was to feel betrayed, because here I was floundering on my own. And so you have to start from the basics in order to regain at least a portion of who you used to be.
That's one of those things a lot of folks who haven't been through this don't even think about. I mean, for decades, you know that when you decide to move your arm is going to move. I mean, you don't even think about it. And then suddenly you decide, I am going to move my arm, and nothing happens.
That's right. You're absolutely right.
So what happened on that day that you had your stroke?
Well, my husband and I had just retired about 6 months before, and we had moved from Chicago down to Florida. So we had been enjoying our new home and our new community. We just really enjoyed being tourists and going on day trips to really get a lay of the land. And we were having fun. We were enjoying it. We knew that there was going to come a point when we would need to find some kind of job, if for no other reason, just to keep ourselves active. So I had a one-day assignment. And so I went through the checklist of everything I needed to be aware of before I got on the job. It wasn't anything that was new to me. I was used to doing these things. I had worked my way into a position of management when we were up north. And so I pretty much knew what the avenues were. So there was no nerves. There was more excitement than anything. Around lunchtime, the man that I was working for had conference with about 17 other middle management people, and they were getting hungry, and the woman who had been in this office forgot to order the lunches. So I told them not to worry about it. I'd take care of it. And I went over to where I needed to pick up the lunches, which was probably about 2 miles away. And when I got over there, they were busy doing it. They were almost done. So I sat down and waited. And he called my name, and I walked up to the counter, and I said to him, "How much do I owe you?" At least that's what I thought I said. Well, when I opened my mouth and the words came out, I didn't recognize what I said. And this poor man was standing there looking at me with eyes about the size of a saucer. And so I asked again, and the same thing happened. So I just handed him the credit card. He gave it back, and I grabbed a couple of the sandwiches. At that time, I knew that I had had a stroke. I don't know how I knew. I just knew I needed to get back and get to the hospital. So there was a couple of other people that came out and brought the sandwiches to the car for me. By this time, my knees were kind of feeling like rubber. I got into the car, and I figured, okay, I've got about 2 miles to drive to get back there. I'm going now. I want to preface this for anybody who's listening to it. Do not do what I did. It's just not. It's not the best thing to do.
It's almost like when your brain is in the process of dying and decaying and being attacked, it's not capable of making the best decisions in the world.
No, yeah, you're right. But I had always been someone who had always been very independent, and I always planned for more than one contingency. If A doesn't work, go to plan B. And that's basically what happened in this situation. So I got into the car and I started to drive back to Tropicana. And as we were talking earlier about, not being able to get your arms or anything to work, I literally would place my right hand on the steering wheel and tell myself to stay. And I would watch my hand just fall to the console alongside me. So I thought, all right, I've got to do this safely. So I stayed in the right-hand lane. And there's a huge building down here called the Red Barn. Well, back in 97, about 3 weeks before, they had this huge fire that just took the Red Barn right down to the ground. So I figured as I was driving back, if I felt worse than I did at that point, I would just drive onto that area and somebody would find me in the smoldering ashes. So that was plan B. I got back to Tropicana. I walked in, and there was a man that was behind me, and he brought some of the sandwiches in. And by the time I got to the receptionist counter, I really did not feel good at all. So I tried to call Bill, my husband, to let him know that I was on my way to the hospital. Well, I dialed the phone number. He picked up the phone, and I told him that I was sick. I was going to the hospital, and there was a long pause. And he said, "I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong number." And I started to cry because I knew he was going to hang up. And I had to think of something that would let him know it was me. And the only thing I could think of was to say October 19th, because that was our anniversary. And there was another long pause, and he said, "What is wrong with you?" And all I could say was, "I'm sick. Meet me at the hospital." And somehow I was able to get those words out as words.
Wow.
And I hung up. I turned around to look, and my car was still out in front. It was still running. I looked at all the people that were coming in and out, and I absolutely hate golfers. And I knew time was really of the essence. So I wrestled with myself. Do I tell them what's going on and have the ambulance come and all these people staring at me? And I was so concerned I was going to do something that was not ladylike. And I really wanted to come back to Tropicana if I survived this. And so I chose to drive myself. And it was only probably about maybe 8 blocks to get there. And I did. And I pulled into the parking lot, and there was no place to park. So I parked in one of the places that an ambulance would. I mean, this is really, really stretching the limit for me for doing things that you shouldn't do.
Well, to be fair, at that moment, your car was kind of an impromptu ambulance.
Well, yeah, it was. Yeah, you're right. So I got there, and wouldn't you know it, the security guard in his little golf cart came around, and he goes, "Lady, you can't park here." And I looked at him and I said, "I think I'm having a stroke." Well, by this time, my mouth is beginning to droop. I was standing at the side of my car. You could see that my shoulder looked like a ski slope. I had no use of my arm. And so he looked at me, and he knew that I was telling the truth. And he said, "Okay," he said, "don't you worry about your car. I'll keep an eye on it." And I'm thinking to myself, it would be nice if you helped me into the hospital. So I locked the door, and I walked in, and there, it was busy in there in the ER. Nobody looked up. And so I stood there, and I said, "I think I'm having a stroke." And everybody dropped everything. I remember the nurse turned around and looked at me and said, "She walked in here?" And somebody scooped me up and put me on a gurney. And except for a couple of flashes, that's all I remember for about 2 weeks.
Wow. First of all, I think Tropicana's got to consider you a hero for saving lunch, because there is very few things that will annoy a whole bunch of office workers besides not getting a promised selection of lunch. That is serious corporate drama, and you saved a whole bunch of people that day.
I should send them a note and tell them that I want a little trophy.
Exactly. And like a lifetime of oranges.
I can get those driving down 9th Street, because when the trucks go around that corner, there's a number of the oranges that fall off.
There's a hobby, scavenging oranges in Florida. I also think what's really telling here, too, is that when we have a stroke and our brains start shutting down, one of the things that happens is we start reverting to some of our most deeply ingrained patterns and habits. It's sort of like everything that's come along later that we learned later, that sort of starts getting thrown away. And it's just sort of that core training, that core habit, that ability to think that in your case, that turned out to be a very core focus on let's solve this initial problem as quickly and efficiently as possible. Let's develop a backup plan, and let's get my primary job done, and let's do it while obeying the law. And all of those things come into play in that story. And, as our brains just try and do this in survival mode, what, is sort of that broader context and that common sense is one of those things that we just don't have in that moment.
But the thing is, you think you do. If you're used to solving problems, you become very, very calm while you're in the midst of chaos, and you know that you have to make it from point A to point B and maybe on to C. And so you think that you're thinking rationally, and you're not.
Exactly. And that's why that is so dangerous.
Yeah.
And it's why it's one of those things where we keep repeating to folks who've survived a stroke and folks who haven't, know your B fast, balance, eyes, face, arms, speech, time to call an ambulance, because we want that to be one of those reflexive patterns that comes to the surface as a first thing, as sort of a core thing when that happens.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I say this every time I speak to anybody: do not do what I did. Don't do that.
So you had your stroke, survived it, got through that initial part, and then moved on to rehab. So when you began your rehab experience, what were your deficits like at that point?
At that point, I was totally paralyzed on my right side. couldn't talk, couldn't see straight. And I never mentioned the seeing part until maybe about a week later, when one of the nurses asked me if I wanted the shot in my arm or in my leg, and I looked at her and said, which one? Because when I looked at her, I saw about 14 needles coming towards me. The area of my brain that was affected is called the thalamus. And it's about a walnut-sized gland that's deep within your brain. But everybody will be able to identify, at least most people. Now, I'm a teetotaler, and so anyone who's a teetotaler, unless you've had a stroke in the thalamus, probably don't realize how this feels either. But this is the area of your brain that affects your inhibitions. And so I would do things that were not proper. Now, I was 52 when I had my stroke, and my occupational therapist was probably about 30. And I would spend at least an hour sitting on the edge of my bed listening to her tell me what the proper thing was in a certain situation, and that you have to act that way. I said, yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, more than I did do any other type of therapy. Yeah, it was very freeing.
Right. Suddenly, not being able to do and say things, and not having that sense of feeling guilty or feeling restrained.
And the restraint part of it, yes. There's one section in the book about going out to dinner with my husband and our neighbor. I think this all gets back to the same thing. You look at what needs to be done in order to do what you need to do to accomplish what's in front of you. And we were at a restaurant, and they had a card aisle, where there were a lot of people that were looking at cards, and this gentleman that he had to be 6'8". He was huge, and he had the shortest shorts. I mean, he would make Daisy May blush. I mean, they were really, really short, and he had these white legs that literally extruded from these shorts. He looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy on vacation. I mean, it's just really... So I looked at him, and we kind of nodded to each other and went back to reading our cards. Now, my husband told me, he said, I'm just going up to the front to let them know that we're here. So do not go anywhere. Don't do anything. Just read the cards. Well, my husband made the mistake of going to the washroom. They called over the intercom our name, and I don't see our neighbor. I don't see my husband. I know I'm hungry, and I know there's this 6'8" man standing in my way to where the food is. So I walked over to him, and I went, hoping that maybe he would see I was on the move, and he would move a little bit so I could get around him. He looked at me, he looked at the cards, and he turned his back on me, like, I'm reading, I'm not moving. Well, now, I should have been walking with a cane, but I wasn't. So it was hard for me to move forward. I'm not going to shoulder him or anything, but I tried again to get his attention, and it didn't work. Now, when you've been a mother, there are certain things that you do when your kids are misbehaving and not listening to what they should do. And that's the way I looked at the ahums I gave him, and he didn't respond to it. So I took the back of my hand, and I smacked him on the butt right at the bottom of the shorts. This man went astral. I mean, he jumped straight up. There was an aisle right next to the cards where he was looking. He ended up there, and he just stared at me, gap-jawed, not sure that what happened actually is what he experienced. And I just walked right through up to the front so we could go eat dinner.
Mm-hmm.
I was very proud of myself.
You solved a problem.
I did. The next morning, I was telling my therapist what had happened, and I sat there, I was just beaming, and told her the whole thing, and she sat there very quietly, and she took my hand and held it, and she said, Miss Joanne, I love you, but we need to talk about your manners.
Oh, and it's amazing because we have to relearn all of that and reconnect with all of that, and at the same time can appreciate the freedom that comes with that time before we relearn and reconnect with all of that. So your rehab experience was a lot of that relearning, a lot of relearning speech and connecting with your vocabulary. But one of the key things that stuck out in the book was that your rehab experience was not just about you, because you also were able to build a great relationship with your roommate, Cody. So I mean,
Yes.
how is Cody doing these days? Are you still in touch with her?
Oh, I hate to tell you this, but she passed away a few years back. But we had a good time, I'll tell you. She had that huge electric wheelchair. And I was in that one that if you don't push those wheels and scoot your feet, you're going to stay in the same place all day. But she had like these little handles in the back right by the battery. And so I'd just grab a hold of one of those handles and we'd figure out where we were going to go, and off we'd go. They always knew that we were going to be in tandem if we were together.
You got yourselves a little train going on there.
Oh, we did, yeah. And we had such a good time together. I mean, there was a almost a 30-year gap between the two of us, but you'd never know it.
So since that time, then, how has your relationship with your therapists evolved? Were you able to still be in touch with them?
I'm in touch with some of them. Some of them I know about, and some of them have kind of drifted to the side. So, but talking to you is making me want to find all of them again, because they were so important in my life back then. And we had a wonderful bond. After I was out of there, I saw them for a number of different occasions, and it was wonderful. Therapists are amazing. And
They really are. I know I was fortunate in my inpatient stay to have a great team I was working with, and I'm still in touch with folks from that experience. A couple of them have even been on the show with Megan and Emily, and with one of my therapists, Olivia. We actually ended up doing a commercial for the hospital together, and it's great
nice
to still be in touch with those folks and the amazing work that they do. And the other thing that I found too is that so many of the therapists who work with stroke survivors inpatient, once folks are discharged, the therapists never see them again. And that can be very hard on their jobs, because they see us at our worst. And then they see us when we're just, when the insurance company has deemed us recovered enough to not die in our homes in the next week. And
you're healed.
Yeah, exactly. But they don't see us, the progress we've made 6 months or a year later, and just going back to visit the therapist in the hospital can be really powerful for us and really powerful for them.
And for them, yes. That's one of the reasons that I love Facebook and the different groups that they have, because so many people feel isolated, and they feel that they've gone as far as they're going to be able to go, and so there's no hope left. And that's not true. They at one time used to tell you you've got 6 months, maybe a year to regain things, and then after that, whatever you have is what you're going to be. And that's not true. I mean, people have regained certain physical things they used to do, or even with speech, they've regained it, and it might be 10 years later. So the one thing I just want to tell everybody is don't ever give up. I think that community, the sense of community is so important. And I think being able to look at life and live it, not in existence, but live life. If there's something that you really enjoy, even if you have to fumble your way through it, say if you like to draw, or even if you're using crayons, I don't care what it is, but if you do something that you really enjoy and it looks horrible, when you first started doing things when you were 4 years, 5 years, 6 years old, it wasn't something that usually would be hanging in an art gallery. But you kept practicing. And the more you use the repetition, the more you're going to grow.
Absolutely. That's the core of getting better at anything. And repetition is the core of stroke recovery and neuroplasticity. And it's all that stuff we started doing where we just tried repeating stuff again and again and again when we were less than 5 years old even.
Exactly. Yeah. That's why kids are my best therapists right now. I'll see a kid over at one of the stores that is hanging off a display, shouting at the top of his lungs. And before I had the stroke, I'd probably walk by him and grumble and wonder where his parents were. And now I look at him and I'm going, "You go, you do it."
So, I mean, you've come a long way since your stroke with your aphasia. How did aphasia then impact your writing ability?
It didn't actually.
Okay, great.
Because I don't write with my mouth.
Right.
I use my hand.
And that's one of those things about aphasia, too, is that it affects so many people differently. In some people, it just affects their speech. In some folks, it affects their ability to speak and write or get any words out. So that's great that you still had your writing at the time.
Exactly. And the thing that some people don't realize when they talk to somebody who has aphasia, they think that they are also mentally limited. And that's not true. Aphasia is a situation where your speech process has been limited, but not your intellect.
When we talk about speaking, there are so many parts in that chain, from the brain, parts of the brain that come up with the thoughts and the ideas and those types of things, to then the decision to express them, to then the part of the brain that has to pair those ideas with the actual words, to then the part of the brain that actually is going to control the larynx and the lips and the tongues and the diaphragm to get those words to come out of your mouth. And if any one of those parts fails, speech fails.
That's right. Yeah. And it's like, when you have aphasia, there's a pause switch that's been affected. So what you're thinking is perfectly fine. What you want to say just doesn't happen because of this pause button. So You just have to keep working. Just like you do with the computer when you can't figure out why the sound isn't working right.
Exactly. And that's sort of where the title of your book comes in, Trapped Within. You've got all these thoughts, but it just becomes so much harder to express them.
Exactly. Yeah, you're absolutely right. When you talk about my hand, though, and writing, my right hand was what was affected. The right side of my body was what was affected by the stroke. So when I first got home from rehab, I felt it was so important that I sit down and capture everything that happened to me, because I did not want to write a book that was going to be a reflection of what happened. I wanted it to be living right then and there. I spent 4 months from the time I came home until I completed the first manuscript on the book. But my right hand was so weak that when I would try to type, it got to a point that spell check wouldn't even listen to me anymore. My fingers would sit there and I'd just have until I could get it up again.
I'm at the point where I'm still just typing with one hand at this point, and it got up to about 30 words a minute, so it's adequate for now. But I think that's the other thing too, is that especially when you had your stroke in the mid-90s, Facebook wasn't a thing. Easy access to lots of cameras and video wasn't really a thing either. I mean, I can go back and look at all my Facebook posts from the time I was in the hospital to remember things that I've forgotten. And one of the things I tell new survivors now, take a ton of pictures and record video and do all of that throughout your recovery, because as your recovery progresses, you may think you're not improving until you look back at those pictures and those videos and all of those other things. And it can really help inspire you to keep doing the work.
Absolutely. Yeah, because you get to a point that you think nothing is going to change. I play handbells, and there are certain techniques that you use when you play handbells. And some of them are called shakes. And when you shake the bell, you rapidly go back and forth and back and forth. Well, I could not get my hand to do this back and forth motion. And my brain and my hand just were not talking to each other for that particular motion. So when I would do it, here's this whole lineup of people that are playing, and they're all very precise, and everybody's moving the same way, and that's part of the magic of watching a handbell player. Well, there I am, up there with my bell in my hand, and my bell's going sideways. I could get it to go sideways, but I couldn't get it to go front and back. And so it was about 2 years later that we were playing at church for a service, and I'm up there and we're right in the middle of the song, and all of a sudden my hand started doing it the right way.
That's
I
awesome.
almost let out a yahoo right as it was happening.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So I think one of the things you're talking about there too, with capturing all of that right when you got home, is really important, because one of your challenges with the stroke was you also experienced some short-term memory loss, and yet in the book you were able to capture a ton of stories. So I mean, how were you able to go back and capture all of that stuff despite the short-term memory challenges?
I think because I kept repeating the stories over and over. While I was in rehab, I would tell somebody else one of the stories. And I would write down notes about different things while I was there. I think one of the things that I wanted to make sure was that it wasn't just the physical that was brought out to people. I also found that mentally there is a real struggle that's going on within. There's no way to get around it. You have to walk through it. But I knew that the book I was writing was specifically for stroke survivors and their families and caregivers, and even for medical people that wanted to know more from the stroke survivor's point of view of what they experienced. And I wanted to make sure that what I wrote was an honest rendering of what I experienced. because that's one thing I've found about the stroke. Anytime you talk to any stroke survivor, there is no giving them a line of anything. They've got like this sixth sense that just picks up on it immediately.
So you've talked about your starting with that initial manuscript. As you moved from that manuscript into the final published version, I mean, what was your writing process like?
Oh my gosh. Well, I wrote the book. I read it. It was all right. But I knew because I've been a freelance writer for 40-some years. And I knew that it was not ready for being out in the general public. And so I knew it needed some more work. And I put it in a drawer and forgot about it for 20 years.
Wow. I think that's one of those things that's really important for a lot of new writers who feel compelled to write a book to recognize, and that as a professional writer, you've picked that up throughout your career, is that the magic really happens not in initially putting the words on paper or the words on the computer screen, but it happens in the editing and the revisions and taking it from draft 1 to draft 2, draft 5, draft 10, and sometimes even letting it sit for a while.
I belong to a group of writers that are just amazing. There's a gentleman who's a professional, who truly is a professional writer. He's written for a number of years, and his name is Richard Paul Evans. He has 46 books that have all been on the New York Times bestseller, number 1 on the bestseller list. And so he has a group of us that he mentors. And so I had gone out for a weekend, a long weekend, and then another time a year later for a week of just immersion in learning how to write properly and how to get a book ready for print. The things that he shared were just absolutely amazing. So I think one of my best pieces of advice for anybody who is a writer is to find yourself someone who's a mentor. And if you're serious about your writing, do it the right way. You know, and everybody has a story to tell. And I love reading stories that are written by people who are first-time writers or have written for a while, but this is the first time they've written anything they consider close to normal for a novel. Make sure you edit properly. There's like about 7 different ways that a book is edited. And if you write something and say, fine, my job is done, I'll pass it on to somebody else, it doesn't work that way. You have to get in the trenches and do the work yourself. It's like eating potato chips. You can't just edit one page. You got to do the next one.
And, you know, I think a lot of folks who just come new to the creative space don't necessarily think about editing, or they want to avoid as much of that as possible and get it right the first time. But there's a problem with that perspective. When you actually accept that, yeah, I'm going to be doing editing and I'm going to be doing revisions and I'm going to be making changes, that can be so freeing, because one of the problems many folks have is they want to get it right the first time. And you spend so much time trying to get it correct, trying to get the writing the right way when you're starting, that you end up not starting and not doing it. You have to be willing to just, let's go ahead and this is my first draft, so let me go ahead and just write crap and fix it later.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, you want to get your story down, and then it grows from there. You have to really think it through as far as what you're doing. You know, especially with Amazon and everything, now people are, you know, everybody you talk to has written a book or they plan on writing a book. Well, you can't really call it a book until you put 60,000 words into it. Something that's 200 or 300 words, you can call a pamphlet, but it's not a book.
Right.
So
right.
If you believe in what you're saying and you feel that you've got a story that you want to share with people, by all means do it. But just make sure that it's absolutely the best thing that you can offer to them.
Right. So you mentioned that it sat in a drawer for 20 years. What inspired you to open that drawer and take it out and take it through this process again?
I think it was when I went out to this conference that I was talking about with Richard. I thought, because I really did believe in this story, and I really felt that there was something that it could do to help other people. And so it was time for me to just get over my nerves from doing it. I didn't have a lot of confidence in myself, even though I had written for 40 years. I've written commercials, I've written all kinds of magazine articles and everything else, but writing a book was different. And so I finally just said, you know what, I'm going to do like I do with everything else in my life. I'm just going to place it at the feet of Jesus, and we'll work on this together. And that's how it began.
It's a process that guided you through stroke recovery. It's a process that can guide you through creating a book.
That's right. Absolutely right.
There have been so many changes to publishing over the last 10 to 15 years with the growth of respectable self-publishing that's beyond just the idea of a vanity press to hybrid models for publishing with traditional publishers and self-publishing combined to traditional publishing models. Your book is self-published, so how did you decide to pursue that course for giving your book life?
I think because I knew that it was a niche market, and I knew that there were certain people that I could advertise to that would be more interested in it than trying to go out to the masses and the bookstores, which the bookstores are wonderful. And there's ways that you can do all of this, but you have to do it step by step. And I think because I knew that this was a niche market, that I had the opportunity to try to do it on my own. And I'm a very curious person. And so I just really wanted to learn more about the industry and everything that it offered. And I'm grateful that I did it that way. It gives me a little more control over my product. If I have a great idea about something, I can go ahead and do it and get it out there, where if I were working with an editor in a publishing firm, I'd have to go through about 6 months of, should we or shouldn't we? And that's got its merit as well. I'm not saying that it doesn't, but I'm just saying for what I'm working on, I feel very comfortable using the pay on demand.
Plus, I imagine it helps, too, that you already have that background as a freelance writer, as somebody with a marketing and advertising background, to be able to bring those skills forward in managing your own project as well. You can apply those skills from your corporate life to producing this book.
Yeah, I wasn't intimidated by that part of it at all. And I think every person who is a writer always struggles with, well, is it good enough? Do I have a market of people that would really appreciate it? And so you have to get over the fear of that part of it. And, when people come back and give you good reviews, it really makes you feel like you're on the right track.
One of the things I really liked about the book is the way you've been able to structure it for this audience. I think it's really accessible for a stroke survivor who may be dealing with neurofatigue, may only be able to read a few pages at a time. With the structure around the short chapters, it's very easy. to consume it in chunks that will work well. And I found it generally to be an easy read.
Thank you. And that was intentional. First off, because that's where I was in my stroke recovery too. I finished that book 4 months after I had my stroke. And so I could only read for a certain period of time. I tried to do it so each article is each chapter is a standalone chapter. So most of the time, the story that you read there may not completely finish there, but it's completed enough that you don't feel that you have to wait until the chapter before the last chapter to find out what happened. When I wrote the book, the very last edit that I did before we sent it over, it dawned on me that there is a major theme that runs through the book, and that is grief. That is one of the major things that I have found with most stroke survivors is dealing with grief. And you go through all of the different phases, just like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had identified. Because what we have lost in our life is so severe. It is such a great loss when you can't move your arm, you can't walk properly, you can't speak to someone else. I drop my toothbrush every single morning because I never figured out I can't hold it in my right hand. So every morning my husband was coming over and bringing me another toothbrush. But you just really begin to realize that until you can come to terms with what you've lost, you cannot begin to search for what you have now. And there is such a beauty in allowing yourself to look out and say, okay, I can't walk from here to there without hanging on to every piece of furniture along the way. So if I have to string 3 dining room chairs together in order to get from the table to the couch, why not? You're getting to where you want to be. You have to think creatively in order to do things for yourself. And let your mind be a child again. Let yourself enjoy the things that are around you. If you want to listen to music, if you found while you were in rehab that you had a love for hip-hop, turn it on and enjoy it. There's so much that we've lost, but there's so much that we can find. And there are a lot of people who have found that they're great artists, they're musicians, and these are talents that they never even realized that they had.
Getting through the phases of grief, and for our folks who are not familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, we'll go ahead and have that over in the show notes over at strokecast.com. But you're going through this process. We're talking about all these things you can discover. So looking back on it now with this perspective of 20 plus years after stroke, was your stroke a blessing or a curse ultimately?
It was a blessing. It definitely was a blessing. It made me slow down and look around. It made me appreciate people. I didn't expect that to make me puddle up, but it did. Because when you look around, people are, in my estimation, genuinely good, and they're kind, and they're loving. And most of the time we get so busy with our lives that we know that's how they are, but we just don't have time to stop and talk to them right now. And you can't do that. You need to stop and tell the people around you, even if you just met them, tell them something good that you see about them. We all need to hear that.
So, Joanne, I mean, this has been a delight. If folks want to know more about you and what you're up to, where should they go?
Well, they can obviously find me on Amazon. I have a website, and it's my name, www.joanneglim.com. And I also do a podcast called Don't Count Me Out. We have a weekly show that we do, and I would love to have you on sometime, Bill, when you have the time. I would love to do that.
I'd love to make that happen.
Thank you.
And we'll have all of those links over in the show notes and at strokecast.com.
Great.
So, Joanne, again, this has been great. Encourage folks to go pick up the book, Trapped Within. And again, we'll link to that over at Strokecast. Thanks so much for joining us this week.
Thank you so much. And anyone who wants to get in touch with me, I love to hear from other stroke survivors. You make my heart just grow.
And that brings us to our hack of the week. But first, let's talk about show sponsor, Modus Nova. Modus Nova helps stroke survivors reconnect with their hands and feet. I use the Modus Hand to help with my left hand. It's an AI-controlled, air-powered robotic exoskeleton that helps drive neuroplasticity through video games. Now, that is a lot of words, but what does it actually mean? Well, for an hour a day, I can wear this device on my arm and hand. It helps me move my hand while I do occupational or physical therapy. If my hand needs help moving past a certain point, it helps. If I'm moving too easily, it resists, so I can continue pushing my limits. The bottom line is that through these movements and these exercises, it's helping me get in the thousands upon thousands of repetitions that I need to drive the neuroplastic change of recovery. To learn more and find out if Modus Nova is right for you, visit strokecast.com/Modus Nova. Use promo code STROKECAST to save 10% off your first month. This week's hack comes from Lainey Ishbia from Trendable.com. That's TREND-able.com. You can learn a lot more about Lainey in the conversation we had a few weeks ago at strokecast.com/trends.
But an easy hack for me is if I want to wear a button-down shirt, instead of getting the magnetic buttons, for me, I just sew up the buttons, have someone sew it. I don't actually sew myself. And I slip it over my head. You know what I mean? It's just a simple nothing, but it works. So you don't have to not get that button-down shirt if you don't mind having a V-neck and having it slip over.
Now let's talk about sponsor Like Minded. Like Minded is a non-profit membership program featuring sessions and classes from some of my favorite people. Online classes are scheduled throughout the week, but if you need more flexibility, members get access to recordings of those sessions. These sessions are run by OTs, PTs, speech therapists, doctors, psychologists, and, of course, stroke survivors. Members can attend as many sessions as they want and even get access to a private text messaging group for more personal support. Get the support you need and deserve by joining Like Minded today. Visit strokecast.com/likeminded to learn more. Use promo code STROKECAST to save 20% off your first month. Joanne Glim actually sent me a copy of her book a few weeks before we talked. And, I mean, she's got a great collection of stories and characters in there that I really enjoyed reading about. I'm actually sorry I never got to meet her rehab roommate, Cody, because she seems like quite an adventure in and of herself. I also like that because of the writing process Joanne talked about, the stories still seem fresh. While her stroke and most of these stories were, more than 20 years ago, they still read like they could have happened just in the past month. It's also an easy read. I think I mentioned this in my conversation with Joanne. The chapters are nice and short, and the paragraphs are crisp. I found myself actually able to easily sort of breeze through the pages. If you struggle to read a book due to fatigue after a stroke or the difficulty of physically holding the pages, Trapped Within actually gives you lots of natural stopping points where you can catch your breath or take a nap. Joanne's book is available on Amazon. You can find it at strokecast.com/trappedwithin. That's my affiliate link. You can also find more links in the show notes, but to buy the book today, just go straight to strokecast.com/trappedwithin. Joanne and I also mentioned Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Kubler-Ross is the researcher who actually described the 5 stages of grief that many of us have heard about in a variety of contexts and pop culture. Those 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and final acceptance. While Kubler-Ross was mainly talking about how to deal with the death of a loved one, this structure generally applies to stroke as well, as we mourn and grieve for the previous version of ourselves. I mean, in that moment, that old version has died, and it isn't coming back. Recovery, though, isn't about turning back into the person we were before the stroke. Sure, it's about regaining function, but it's also about accepting that this process has changed us. And so it's okay to grieve. Kubler-Ross gave us a roadmap through that process so the folks around us can make sense of our actions, our reactions, and our thoughts, and we can grow through it all. Finally, I just want to ask, have you signed up for the Strokecast newsletter? Just visit strokecast.com/news. Each month in this free newsletter, I include an essay about post-stroke life, updates from previous guests, synopses of previous episodes, and just some personal updates. So sign up today, and if you have any updates to share with the community, go ahead and let me know about that as well. I may be able to include them in a future issue. You can sign up at strokecast.com/news. So be sure to head over to the show notes to learn more about Joanne. You can also find all of the links we talked about over there in the show notes as well. That's over at strokecast.com/Joanne. You can, of course, share this episode with someone you know by, again, just giving them that link, strokecast.com/Joanne, so they can see those show notes as well, and, of course, listen to this conversation, and then you can talk about it with them. Be sure to subscribe to the free monthly Strokecast email newsletter. Just visit strokecast.com/news in order to do that. And, of course, as always, don't get best. Get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you soon.
The Strokecast, Bill Monroe, and Bill's guests provide general information and entertainment, not medical advice. Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan or the execution of your treatment plan without first consulting your personal doctor or medical team. The Strokecast is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.